This, I believe, is the sixth session of Stuff Every Christian Should Know. And today we're going to cover we're going to circle back just to the end of King Solomon and David and sort of just do an overlay of that, or just an overview of that before we delve into it. For those of you who are joining us online after the fact, if you would like these files, you can send me a text or an email and just let me know. But there are two things that I sent all of you. One looks like this, and it's very small print, and if your eyes are bad, you won't be able to use it, but it was the best sort of timeline summary. I don't know why they use so much space up here. I think they really didn't space it well. That's a formatting issue. But if you want to see the whole cycle of kings when Israel became a kingdom with Saul all the way to exile where they did not have a king after that in the same way. This is the resource, and you can follow this along if you want to highlight some points in there. This sheet that you have, did I give you this? Did I give you this one? Where's mine? Wait, is this mine? Mine has writing on it. That's mine. This is, and Silas, you need one too. Sorry, you need one of each of these. And I'll have these. I have extra copies if anyone is in town and they want them. But on this sheet, and again, if you're joining us online and you want this, I can email you the PDF. For those of you online, you should have it in your mailboxes. The kings that I think that we should know about are highlighted in blue. And that's what we're going to go over. I'll go over generally some of the other ones, we'll identify them, name them, but we won't go into detail. But if you're looking at this document, the kings that I think that you should be familiar with their names, there's probably, you could argue a few more in there, but I was trying not to get too many in there. But the names in blue are the kings that ruled both in the northern and the southern part of Israel. And then the prophets I've listed in different colors. And so on the United Kingdom, but before the divided, you have three prophets, and we'll go over these. But you have Samuel, then Samuel and Nathan, then you have Nathan. And then you move over here to this goes over the kingdom of Judah, which is the southern kingdom. There's the Rehoboam's at the top in blue, and then when you get to the second page, you'll get to and you'll notice that all of the prophets all of the prophets on the second, or I guess it would be maybe just third page. All the prophets in the southern kingdom I've highlighted in purple. This goes along with the cards that I made if you want a color copy, but that's the linking of that. And likewise, when we get to the northern kingdoms, all the kings are all still in blue, but the northern kingdom prophets are in red. And that's just a coding. Sometimes people see in color, and then the prophets in exile on the very back are in green. So I did that so if you think of, I think this is one of the ways I'm trying to say when we start talking about the prophets in a few minutes, one of the best ways to think about the prophets is in United Kingdom, and then once you have the divided kingdom, think of them in northern and southern, and then you could really have post and exilic and post-exilic category together, and often, and then there are a handful of others that actually are minor prophets that are in the Bible that filter into various smaller narratives. Israel kept these books. Some of them weren't even prophets to Israelites. There were prophets that were to other people around Israel, but their record of their words or their prophecies are still recorded. For those of you who are joining us, like Mike, for the first time, and again, you can have these files. I also can send these to you. This is the playing game, the game that I created. Mike was making fun. I thought he was giving me a serious compliment, but I realize now but they're funny. You can't say that bear one with Elijah getting eaten isn't hilarious, or the kids getting eaten. Anyway, the sheets that I gave you, we went all the way up to King Solomon, which was at the top. That's where we left off last week. And so we're going to kind of pick up the narrative of King Solomon and the division of Israel And then we're going to take a break from the cards, although they do represent the timeline. You'll be able to go back to the cards and see where they fit into the timeline. But, and I'll say this of all of the areas of the Bible is my weakest area. Whenever they talked about prophets in any seminary or graduate school class that I've ever had, I know that I glazed over because I was like, oh, there's so many, and I had to keep track of them. So but I think we need to know some of these, and so I'm in the process of synthesizing this. So this is really sort of my first go at delving into the prophets, trying to figure out a way of the prophets that I think are notable, and I think those are the major prophets mostly, and the minor prophets, if you're just aware of them, that's probably fine. But of the major prophets, I think there's some things and there's some prophets, some key prophets that we need to be aware of, what they represent. So take notes as you will. I also have in my mind, I kind of see prophet playing cards, or a game that involves some sort of prophets, matching them with their kings. I'm not sure. I'm noodling around with that idea. Last week we kind of rushed through the end, but just to pick up where we were at, because of the fact that when we talk about the prophets of the Old Testament, some would say that Moses was a prophet. They would group him into that, and by that just meant that I think that he prophesied what the future of Israel would be in some way, in a sense of teaching. But I don't think we actually get to like proper prophets until we get to Samuel. And so that actually starts back on the previous page, that where we looked at King David and his anointing, and you have Samuel in the midst of that. And then we know the story of David and Bathsheba. He sees a woman that does not belong to him, violating the Ten Commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. He takes her, he has relations with her. He realizes, what's that? No, this is David, King David. We're back at King David. And King David, but then where his real crime is that he goes and he kills Uriah, her husband, to try to cover it up and to make it right. So he causes more harm in his cover story. And so that was part of the reason that God said, or maybe the main reason God said, you will not be the one to build my temple. Your son will. And so what happens is you go from the succession of Saul with the prophet Samuel, followed by King David and his rise to succession through David and Goliath and etc., all the way up through, really, I mean, even in the favor was still with him, even though he was sinning with Bathsheba. And then ultimately, from Bathsheba, Solomon is born. And I think that's an important thing, that you have, again, this from sin, from wickedness, righteousness prevails. But Samuel, and you get into Nathan as the prophet for David, and Nathan becomes then the prophet that calls David out on his indiscretions with Bathsheba, but eventually they give birth to Solomon, and that's where we kind of left off last week. So as we pick it up with Solomon, if you think, just in terms of, when you think of biblical history, one of the hinge points that's always been helpful for me is David is 1,000. It's probably not exact, but if you think David is 1,000, you can then go on either direction and have the history unfold. And again, in the earlier years of Abraham, we're not even sure about the fullness of the exact nature of the years, even in the cards. But after David, you have David and Bathsheba have I don't know what succession, but it wasn't the child that came out of that indiscretion. But Solomon comes a son later or so, and he reigns in Israel, still United Kingdom, from 970 to 930. And King Solomon is known, his legacy probably most is known for building the temple. And then also he's known for his wisdom. We have the story of him saying, above riches, above everything else, give me wisdom, which I also think is funny, because it's kind of like taking, the son of the richest person in the world and being like, what do you want? He's like, I already have everything, but I want wisdom. But he was known for wanting wisdom. There's the whole story of him threatening to cut a baby in half, and everyone resorts to that. I think that's kind of cruel wisdom, but nonetheless, shrewd wisdom perhaps. But he is responsible, or is credited for, writing Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs, or Songs of Solomon. Even though he probably didn't likely write all those proverbs, he's still credited with that. There is a seasonal nature to the proverbs that is notable, in particular when read alongside of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, though, to me is kind of like if Solomon, I don't know what he was going through, like a blue phase, where he's like everything's hevel, everything's vapor, everything's to waste. So, but Ecclesiastes is credited to him or to some remnant of his wisdom. He also was made trade with the Queen of Sheba in Egypt and brought a considerable wealth in trade. So even though the Davidic kingdom began with David, you would say it was at its peak or its height with Solomon. Those were his things that he was credited with being good, like those were like his positive attributes. He's also known, and where his downfall comes is as is commonly known, and I have no problem mentioning, David had many wives and concubines. Solomon had many wives and concubines. I think the number of 1,000 comes to mind. So again, not normal marital vows to what the New Testament presents, but this was also why you can't make an argument for biblical marriage from the Old Testament, because it was a different culture at the time. But it wasn't the problem that he had too many wives. It was the problem that he began to worship the pagan idols of his wives. So I don't know, and we don't know why, whether that was the seductiveness of the particular wives, it was just because he opened himself up to this, but he started worshiping other idols, and eventually that led to his downfall. He lost his respect for Yahweh, and eventually, before he died, he actually gave his kingdom to what is it here? He gave his kingdom to his son Rehoboam, and originally when he got it, he ruled over 12, but he was the rightful son and heir to the throne. But the council of the elders of that time in Israel were encouraging him to live in faithfulness, but he was consumed with probably the dark triad of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. But he began to rule in tyranny. Israel rebelled. Israel hung on with this sort of tyranny. The kingdom, all of a sudden, what was once a godly kingdom was becoming a kingdom of oppression. And so there were those who rebelled in Israel. In particular, it grew after Solomon's death. And then they called back Jeroboam. And I will confess, over the last few years, I've said that Jeroboam and Rehoboam were his sons. They actually are not both his sons. Rehoboam is his son. Jeroboam was like a son to him, but Jeroboam was the son of one of his officials. And Ahijah, the prophet, there was a prophet that we'll talk about today. It's it's like Elijah, Ahijah. He met with Jeroboam, who was the officer's son, and he ripped up a new cloak into 12 pieces, and Jeroboam essentially took 10. And I should say why this was all going on, because Jeroboam was in such favor with the king. When Rehoboam came in to rule, Jeroboam fled to Egypt and then returned after Solomon died. And what eventually happened was Jeroboam in the north, he got the northern part, he got 10 of the tribes of Israel that remained, and they were just clustered north, and it was partly geographic, but he ended up getting the 10 of the northern kingdom, and he was crowned king over that kingdom, and they were known as Israel. And you could also say that because of the bulk, they had the majority of them, they felt like there was some sense of, they claimed the name, so to speak. Rehoboam, who was Solomon's actual son, got Judah and Benjamin, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and retained Jerusalem as the capital, and in the north you had Samaria as the capital. Now pause for a second and just think about that. All of the issues in the New Testament about Samaria. So already you have the beginning, although the major hatred for Samaritans come back when they return from exile. But even in the early 900s, you have the seeds of although they were all Israelites, now that they're separated as a nation, and there are those in the north who felt like Jeroboam was sort of carrying on the legacy of King Solomon, but then there's Rehoboam, who's the true Davidic descendant, who was in the south, who was maintained. So you had Jerusalem and Samaria. Two capitals pitted against one another. Jeroboam in the north was an evil king, and he began to build altars. There were golden calves in Bethel and Dan, and eventually this led to, in the north, what they say basically was, I think there are about 20 kings in the north and the south, and we'll look at some of those. And we'll actually go through them, but most of the ones in the north were known as evil. And in your coding, that's why they're red. And in the cards, if you had the color version of it, if I sent that to you, that's why those prophets you see here, Mike, this signifies for those playing the game to help them. I even put an N on one of his shirts to kind of try to blend it in. But the idea behind it is if we can separate these sort of things from north and south. But my point in this is before we get into, and as we get into these kings of Jeroboam and Rehoboam, kingdoms that ruled by these kings, if you're trying to remember a category of prophets, you could put United Kingdom, which was roughly 10,000 and 900 or something like, or 1,000 to 900. You have a little before 1,000, but you have two main prophets during the United Kingdom, and that is Samuel and Nathan. So when you think of David and Solomon and Saul, think of Daniel and Nathan. Those were the prophets, and they were instrumental in guiding the development of the kingdom, the leading into the climax of the kingdom. So their role as prophets was quasi-priestly, but they were also dealing with a people who were already identified as Israelites. As we move into this divided kingdom, as people start to marry foreigners, as they start to worship pagan idols, all of a sudden all sorts of ideology comes in, and you could argue it's kind of like the idea I love, and I'm not saying this, I'm saying this is a parallel, I'm not saying this is the way it's designed, but everything in the Old Testament uses the little person. They made fun of Noah. Abraham was a nobody, a shepherd. Moses was in a basket. David was a shepherd in scrawny, and so on and so forth. And you all go back to the baby birth of the birth of Jesus as a baby, baby Jesus being born. When you even look at it geographically, and you think, well, there are 10 kingdoms of the north and there are 2 kingdoms of the south, and they were Benjamin and Judah, and this is where the Davidic line was preserved. And so you see this motif of the weak or the small or the still this sort of heart that runs through. And because, remember, as we talked about the covenants, the Adamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and the Davidic covenant, as we covered last week, this was the preservation of the Davidic covenant. Despite the separation, God was still preserving. And whether there's a significant, I don't have anything about the significance of 2 and 10, but the important thing to see is that it wasn't like split 50-50. And really what you have is, interestingly enough, you have Samaria as sort of the barrier. So when you look at modern, or like Jesus's time, north of the Sea of Galilee, you start to see that barrier, that region of Samaria. And that's, so the dividing line was sort of like the controversial border between them. Okay, so let's just do a quick overview before we get into the actual kingdoms. I will say that the sheet that I sent you that looks like this is not from me. I added some stuff to it. I added the color coding. I formatted it, but it originally came from a guy named Jacob Etzen, and it's on Bible Gateway. But I poured through resources. And this was probably, it's not perfect, but I think it really, like if you drew it out, it'd be the best, and we'll get into those. It provides way more detail than you'll ever want, and I don't think you need to remember 95% of it. But it's there so you can see the chronology, and again, because now we've done Nathan and Samuel as being the prophets of the United period. We're going to enter into the northern and southern kingdoms. Yes, Silas?
It's split in northern and southern, like which 2 tribes became northern Israel.
Benjamin and Judah, which is the Davidic line, ended up being right in the south around Jerusalem. So in this picture here, for those of you at home, the purple part on the bottom, you can see it's kind of maybe 40% or something. That part is Judah, and then the top part is Israel. So I wanted to name Silas Israel, so we had Judah and Israel, but Shannon said no. All right, let's get into the Northern Kingdom. Yeah, house divided. So let me just do an overview of the two kingdoms. We can start with the Southern Kingdom because that's the way we'll look at them here in a minute. But the Southern Kingdom lasted longer. So even though it was smaller geographically, it had a run after the division for about 350 years. There were 20 kings that were all from the Davidic line. So this is an important piece in terms of prophecy for Jesus. You need the Davidic line to sort of, so again, the small remnant left there to maintain the Davidic line. Rehoboam, who led the southern kingdom, was from 931 to 913, so it wasn't a huge reign, but he was the first king, and he was, again, Solomon's genetic son. I would say, although I've highlighted a number of kings, there are three kings, and I'll say these again, but Hezekiah, these are the good kings, or I guess verse 2 I'm going to give you. Hezekiah is known as a good king. We'll talk about him. He was responsible for religious reform, removing pagan shrines. We'll talk about Josiah. He was also a good king. He inspired national reforms. He also discovered the book of the law and helped because of that, because now had a sacred text, they could institute some of the statutes. They were both kings, and we'll talk about them in sequence. But just when you think about names from the southern kingdom, from Judah, Rehoboam being the first is important to remember. Hezekiah and Josiah were the good kings. In other words, the bad kings don't really matter until the prophets that they're prophesying against. But in general, if I were to draw a sort of 50-50, like a huge 50,000 foot perspective, you basically have, in both northern and southern kingdoms, amongst all sorts of sins and wickedness that probably God would have been considered sin, idolatry was one of the main ones in turning away from God. The general view is most prophets were either there to give doom, or there to give doom and hope, or there to justify some facet about God's existence, or to make a claim on who God was. Again, shaping of Israel, the prophets were there not, and so, but when we think of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, you got to think of the northern kingdom as almost losing much of their spiritual identity. They were a Middle Eastern people group being led by kings in the history of Israel, and although eventually there's unification, the vast majority of when we say Israel, what we're talking about were the people in southern Israel, in Judah. When they go to exile and they come back and they reestablish Second Temple Jerusalem, that when we talk about Jews today, we're talking about that as the epicenter. So the northern kingdoms, although they are still Jewish, just as much as the southern were by virtue of blood, their Jewish identity fades over time in both the diaspora and the overtaking of the Assyrians and the Babylonians in succession. Zedekiah, you'll hear me talk about him. He's important. He was an evil king. He was the final king of southern Israel. And he led them basically into their exile. And I think he was blinded and brought to exile and captured and tortured. And then I'll come back to this, but the southern kingdom fell in 586. And then in that period, during that period when it falls, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is the one that invades and takes over. The first temple that was built by Solomon is destroyed and desecrated. And like I said, the last king, Zedekiah, was captured, blinded, and exiled to Babylon. And that ended, this is important, that ended the Davidic monarchy from that point forward. It never exists again. existing Christ, but the earthly Davidic monarchy of the southern kingdom never exists again. So we're going to talk about that, and then, but I want to do these as an overview, so you're sort of going, and then we'll go deeper. Now think of the northern kingdom. These are the 10 kingdoms. These are the 10 kingdoms being led by Jeroboam, the official son, or the officer's son, who was like a son to Solomon, and who was favored, and who again was exiled during the time of Rehoboam, and comes back after Solomon dies. The northern kingdom, however, is only survived about 200 years before they were overtaken by the Assyrians. There were 19 kings in the north, and according to biblical writers, they were pretty much all bad, all evil, constant idolatry, constant, like just breaking every law. Like there was no sense of Jewish identity. It was, and this is 200 years. We're celebrating our 250th year in this country. So think about like the length of time Israel was under northern Israel under oppressive rule. The first king that we'll talk about here in a minute in a little more detail is Jeroboam. And again, he's that officer, and he ruled from 1931 to 1910, so a little bit longer. And the two figures that we'll talk about mostly in terms of the kings of the north that relate to the stories of like Isaiah are King Ahab, and he was in 874 to 853. He was married to Jezebel, who was from another nation and promoted the worship of Baal. So the famous story of Isaiah and the fire to prove whose God was more powerful comes in that setting, and that's in the northern kingdom. So some of these stories we're trying to anchor in the particular region that they were in. And I think really timeline, as long as you know, this is a 200-year period. If you have like this person was there and then this person was there, or this prophet was there and this prophet was there, there's only a few major ones that you need to sort of hold on to. And the last name we'll talk about, and just to keep in mind, is Hosea. Hosea was the last king, and that was 732 to 722. And in 722, you have the Assyrian siege that overtakes the northern kingdom. And we don't talk about the northern kingdom's Assyrian siege as the exile, because they were captured and taken as many as prisoners, many as servants, and others fled. And so this is part of the diaspora. If you hear this, the phrase the diaspora of Jews. And this is also in what's going to happen in this period from this point really until the intertestamental period, is you start to see the beginning of smaller synagogues or places of worship, because the centrality between the diaspora of the Assyrian attack and the exile of the Babylonian attack, you have Jews spread.
Did all temple worship end at the beginning of the exile?
No, the thought is that there was still a Jewish practice in the exile, but they were persecuted for that, and it probably wasn't in places of worship. Up to this point, Jerusalem was it. Like Jerusalem, and then you had Samaria, and then obviously Jeroboam. But he put those were false gods. He put golden calves in Dan and Bethel, and but what you see is the centralization of worship in Jerusalem, which has been, again, when we talk, for those of you joining us through this whole thing, we're talking about the presence of God, how it went from Adam and Eve, really present, not present, all the way up various spots to Moses, where you have the pillar and the cloud, and then you have the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant, and then you have the temple, and then you have built in Jerusalem, and this becomes where God exists. So at that point, everyone is still coming into Jerusalem to worship. This is where the central place of worship is. In the midst of, from Solomon and the split of Israel to probably into the intertestamental period, and all the way up, I think by the time Christ came around, things were probably fairly established. I don't think there were a lot of new sects being developed, but you had the acceptance of having synagogues, satellite synagogues, so to speak, And what this is this, and I like to view this, for again, for those of you who've been joining us from when we talk about Adam and Eve and Noah, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. I would say in some sense, the diaspora, the spreading of Jewish temples was something that although God's presence was there, God wants his presence to be taken out. So it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was a necessary thing because it was unsafe for Jews during this period to sometimes travel within the kingdom, and they certainly didn't have a lot of intermingling. They weren't like, it wasn't like Canada and the U.S. where Israel was Judah's hat. We like to say that about Canadians. That's America's hat. I'll just say that. You're Canadian, right?
Yeah.
Aren't you Canadian?
We
got to still. It's just funny. It's not. I mean, you call us your pants, whatever. I mean, I know you have your drop. Yeah.
That's even worse.
So all that's to say is you have, again, think of the Northern Kingdom, evil. Northern Kingdom, 200 years before they were spread and taken over. Northern Kingdom is where Samaria is located. Northern Kingdom, animosity. It is not the bloodline. Southern Kingdom, bloodline of Solomon, the remnant of Israel. They're the ones who get exiled to Persia and then come back and reestablish the temple. So when you think of modern day Jews, you're talking about exiled Jews that come back. Not to say that there still wasn't intermingling between them. I'm not going to suggest that, but the heart of Jesus's line has to come through the Davidic succession. Okay, let's get into. Let's take the sheet that and again, you can take this sheet for those of you at home. You want one of those? Is that what you need? That's small print, but it gives you the giant overview. For those of you who we've just sort of done the top there with Saul, David, and Solomon, and now we're getting into, and what we'll do first is we'll look at we'll look at Judah on the left. So for those of you who are following along, do you have that sheet on that Silas? You can see Rehoboam, it says son, and it says evil, evil. And you go down and you'll see Jehoshaphat says good, good. In general, scholars pretty much think most of them were evil. So although in the Southern Kingdom, that I think 12 of them were evil and 8 of them were good. I don't remember what the breakdown is. But you notice at the top it says Judah start and end. So when Rehoboam came in, even though he was the son of Solomon, even though he was the Davidic heir, he was still considered evil and evil. And so you go down his son, Ajabah. I don't really try to pronounce these, as you all know. I'm just going to slop it through my way through it. And then his son Asa, and you see all the way down that central column, it's every king after that says son, 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 son. So this is Solomon's bloodline. And then you look down and he says evil, evil, good, 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 evil, 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 good, evil, good, evil. So they started good, they went evil. I don't think you see any evil turn good. Most of them were either evil or they came in good and turned evil. If you want to circle some of those, Jehoshaphat right there is the good, good. You'll come down to Uzziah. We'll talk about him. He was good, but he turned evil. Hezekiah was the one who brought reform. He's good, good. And then you down to Josiah in the 640 to 608. He's good, good. We're not highlighting, I'm going to highlight, basically in times of good good kings, you don't really have, you have prophets that are there that exist in the overlap, but those are the good kings that we'll highlight in this. So if you turn to the sheet that you have, and again, this is that guy's text, I didn't do that, but I did like the way he broke it down. So you start up there, Rehoboam. Just remember, Rehoboam, he's the king of the south. He was the son of Solomon. There's a prophet named there. You don't have to remember that prophet. You'll never be, unless you're doing Bible quiz, you'll never probably even know that prophet. But that prophet survived through all the way to Asa in 870 by the end of his reign. If you're following along, we're at the kingdom of Judah, just so you know where we're at. We're on that side. You get to Jehoshaphat, and again, the first two kings were evil, and then you have at Azra, you have a turn. He was a devout king. He was a good king. You can see there's a quote. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and you'll see that phrase again repeat throughout the scriptures. That was the sign that they were doing something okay. It goes down, you see you making, the Jehoshaphat makes peace with Israel. He was a good king. He was 870 to 848. You have his son come in. Again, no prophets are still playing into this, but he marries this daughter of Ahab of Israel, bringing idolatry to Judah and drawing the plague upon him. So you have a shift here. And this shift is important because it goes into a time where you're going to start to see prophets arrive here shortly. It goes into Azariah, who again was the son. You just follow the succession. You're going to see idolatry. He ruled for less than a year. He was considered evil. You get to Athaliah. Again, no prophet still there. Didn't rule for super long. These were small. It was the only woman to rule. And also attempted to kill our grandchildren. If you want to see those stories, those are listed. The scriptures are there. Again, considered evil. And again, these aren't things you need to know. But when you get here to the Joash, or the Joash or Jehoash in 835 to 796, again, this is the son of Uzziah. But this is where the prophet Joel is located. And Joel was a prophet that warned about the day of the Lord judgment coming. And this was southern Israel. So they're about 100 years or so, or 200 years, I don't know how many, 150 years or so away from exile. And he was calling the people back. Joel called the Israelites, the southern kingdom, back to a national repentance, and promise future restoration. But he was probably one of the first prophets of southern Israel to come on the scene. So when you think of Joel, think of him as an early prophet. You go down and you have sons and sons, and you can read, if you take this home, you can read, it says notable for, and it gives you some information. You don't need to really remember that in the flow of it. You can just remember from Rehoboam to Uzziah, which is really where you start to get one of the major prophets, which is Isaiah. There were good kings, there were bad kings. There was idolatry involved. It wasn't, and Joel comes in there. If you got to just remember, Joel is a southern prophet. And really until Uzziah, 767 to 748. Now, the reason this is important is this where you start to have, even though he was a good king for the most part, this is where the prophet Isaiah comes in. And something to know about the prophet Isaiah, he is considered the prophet of salvation. Isaiah, for many, is considered the fifth gospel. It is well known that was written in 3 parts in Isaiah. This is the pre-exile Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet that is known to have written before exile. This is called Proto-Isaiah. And then he wrote in exile, the exilic Isaiah. And then he writes in the post-exilic period as well. And you see these 3 sections of Isaiah pieced together into what we have is just one continuous book. He wrote about God's majesty in Israel. It was a prophecy of what is yet to come. He also prophesied about the consequences of the national sin, which was essentially idolatry. He was also the one who promised the Messiah. At certain times of the year, we talk about, other times of the year, but also at Christmas, we talk about the suffering servant in Isaiah 55. He is one of the prophetic voices that pointed to the idea of this Savior figure coming. Now, keep in mind that there are many throughout history, and before Jesus arrived on the scene, thought that was King Cyrus, who came, and the Persians who overtook the Babylonians, and then some years after basically released all of the captives of Persia that belonged to other nations. And King Cyrus's desire was, let's send them back, let's give them resources, let's establish them as nations, because his philosophy was collaboration was better than conquering. And so he wanted healthy relationships with neighbors, so he supplied them. So Israel has a great debt of gratitude towards the Persians and King Cyrus, but for many, that was the suffering servant, that he was the fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah, because King Cyrus, although not being a Jew, came in and rescued them. Isaiah also talked about the restoration of Zion as a whole. And so much of our apocalyptic or our understanding of Israel being a place that will one day be reestablished, but that geographic location matters, comes from Isaiah. Uzziah's son, it wasn't Uzziah's son, Jotham was the next one, 748 to 732. That was Azariah's son, also again from the line of David. You have Isaiah and Micah coming into play there. And again, Isaiah, that was still or proto. How you doing? Tiger Center is closed, but but you are welcome to come in and join us for a Bible study.
Oh, sure.
If you don't have to, I mean, you can come back. We open tomorrow at 9. So
I just use the restroom?
sure, go for it, man. But Isaiah and Micah come into play in there. They all go all the way through Ahaz. And Ahaz, you'll come down, was one of the most notable evil kings of the south. I look back just down there as a super evil. He is when people talk about kings of Israel, he is always at the top of the list because he was known for child sacrifice. And he was also known to become, and he started the process, you'll see it says notable for becoming a vassal state of Assyria. Israel just didn't all of a sudden it wasn't like the Assyrians are like, let's go invade Israel. He is the one who started the crumbling of their independence, becoming a vassal state to Syria, and there's a lot of information as to why he did that, but in the end, that led to the beginning of the end. Hezekiah in 716 to 687, you have Isaiah and Micah continuing on in that. And this is, and you look down there, it says Hezekiah, first king of Judah to remove the high places and to stop idolatry, rebelled against Assyria and regained independence. And so in his work against, where is it? First king. Removing high places, meaning altars and places where there were idols, and he stopped the idolatry. They rebelled, and again, they rebelled against it. He was considered good, and again, that quote is very apt. The Lord was with him. Wherever he went, he prospered. So you have the king Hezekiah, who was one of those, as we said, who moved to a reform. He brought about Jewish identity. And what you have in each of these sort of kings interspersed is, it's not as if they just all of a sudden could turn a nation on its end and get everyone. This was a movement back towards reform. So if you think of any denomination or any tradition throughout the history of the last 2,000 years, you see this pendulum swing always between different doctrines, but different social issues, and there's always a call of reform. So Hezekiah and Josiah, as we'll look at here in a second, was also a king of reform. You're going to ask something, like you're pondering something, like?
No, well, the only thing I came across, which I thought was interesting in your statement about becoming a vassal state, Isaiah 7, he says that he will bring the king of Assyria. It's a fulfillment of exactly what the Lord was bringing through. So he's just using him as a vessel to be the vassal.
Well, and the larger providential perspective of all of this is that God, and there's an overlay of providence that said God's orchestrating some of this and moving some of this, and there's also an overlay of God's sovereignty with free will that says they're rebelling and God's leaning into it. God's like, okay, it's kind of like with Saul. You want a king? Fine, have a king. You want to worship other idols? Fine, there are consequences to this. And this is where, as they lean into this idol worship, you have some of these prophets coming and warning them against that. Amon is known, he was the son of Manasseh. He is known for returning to idolatry. He's another evil king. You may hear his name again. You don't remember him because he doesn't really come up. Josiah does, though. Josiah is a pretty important one in terms of being a good king, 640 to 608, and this is right before. This is getting right before, still before before they're overtaken by Babylon. In those periods, and you see prophet, you see Huldah. You don't ever need to remember that name ever again. It probably will never come up unless you're doing Bible quiz. But Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah are those that come in there and play into that. Zephaniah was a prophet that warned against universal judgment and the day of the Lord coming, but also promised future salvation and a cleansing for the faithful remnant. And again, he's speaking to this remnant that will ultimately be the remnant. So even this is before exile, he's saying there's going to be a restoration. So even in exile, there were Jews that had in their mindset, to some extent, restoration is coming. It just wasn't the restoration that they were going to get in their time frame or in their lifetime, probably. Habakkuk is known for his dialogue with God regarding the problem of evil. And he emphasizes living faithfully and trusting in God's justice. So he's very justice-oriented. Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, who's known as the weeping prophet, he was the one who gave warnings of Babylonian exile and was like, this is it, folks. We need to pull it together or this is going to not work out. He called individuals to a place of piety and righteousness and leaving behind their wicked ways. But probably what Jeremiah is most known for, we open at 9 in the morning, so we'll see it then. Yeah, no worries. The promise of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31, and I think every Christian in the whole wide world should know the biblical reference Jeremiah 31. You don't have to remember the verses in it, but that chapter is probably one of the most significant chapters in the entire Old Testament. Jeremiah 31, it's just be the new covenant is, I mean, doesn't remember, you want to remember the Abrahamic covenant being, what I don't know, maybe 19, I don't know what it said. Genesis 19, it doesn't make a difference. Remember the Abrahamic covenant, the 3 things that he gave, land, people, name. Jeremiah 31 is the promise of the new covenant, and Christ is the process through which that new covenant is fulfilled, but the new covenant is fulfilled when the Holy Spirit comes. So much of the rest of Isaiah and Jeremiah and some of these others that prophesy what is yet to come, point to Jesus, they're talking about the redemptive work of Jesus. Jeremiah's talking about what will happen because of that redemptive work, but what Jeremiah is pointing to is Pentecost. The arrival of the Spirit, and at the arrival of the Spirit, at the redemption of that, now God dwelled in the hearts of humanity. And no longer you have to say, know your brother, or know God to your brother. And then he carries on a little bit of the Davidic kingdom. Do you have that in front of you? I don't have it printed out. Can I see your Bible? And I'll read that to you because it's worth having out there. Jeremiah 31, and it's not exactly 31, but if you go to 31, if you remember just that number, I guess it is 31, but there's other stuff before that you probably want as well. The time is coming, declares the Lord, and he's talking about the new covenant fulfilled in the Holy Spirit coming. The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. It will not be like, and with the house of Judah. So there you have, again, this is a time where you have both. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. And if you don't understand the divided kingdom part, then this passage makes no sense in terms of that part of it. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers. And so although you have the Adamic, you have the Noahic, you have the Mosaic, Abrahamic, and you have the Mosaic, he's talking directly, kind of the most extended one here at the Mosaic covenant. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand and led them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant. And that covenant that he's referring to, again, is the Abrahamic covenant and those before that. Though I was their husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. And when he says that, he's not just talking about necessarily the house of Israel. Now he's talking about it more of in a unified sense. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds, and I will write it on their hearts. And keep in mind, without the Spirit, the law can't be on their minds and it can't be written on our hearts. This is why you have so much unfaithfulness. You have a lack of capacity to be righteous. You have a lack of capacity to know, and everything through Jewish catechesis of passing down the story and the covenants deals with teaching people that don't have the capacity. Their very disposition is not inclined towards righteousness. So it's a constant overcoming of one's innate dispositions. When the arrival of the Spirit comes, this is the result. Now, We have the law in our minds, and God writes it in our hearts. And for those of you who we'll get to this eventually in weeks to come, but when we talk about Immanuel Kant, like in 10 weeks or something like that, Immanuel Kant has something that he's known for called the categorical imperative, or the moral imperative. And that essentially means that he is taking what the new covenant is, which is God writing the law in our minds and writing on our hearts, is saying that everyone who is born has a moral compass in them that says this is wrong and this is right. Killing someone else is wrong. Helping someone else is right. Remember, this was not something that the Israelites understood before the Ten Commandments. If God had to say, thou shalt not murder, clearly it was like, I mean, obviously they understood the social ramifications of murder and vengeance and things, but as a moral category to say murder was wrong, after the Spirit comes in, we talk about, what about decent people? Are they not saved? Do they not? No, they have the Spirit living within them, which is the regenerate part, which allows them to say, somewhere in their mindset, because God renewed all of humanity in that regard, and the Spirit was imbued upon all of humanity, that, hey, something about doing something for myself is not higher than doing something for someone else. This general category is what Kant is talking about. And what you see when God writes his law, I will put my law in their minds. His law was based on love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he writes that on our hearts. So now, individually, in every single one of us when we're born, we have a moral compass that's guiding us. And the theory behind that, or the theology behind that, is even if you had a Tarzan person who was raised by apes in the jungle, they would still, even though they had never encountered human ethics or that theoretically or theologically, that individual, that Tarzan, never seeing human race, would still have some sense of knowledge of good versus evil, of self, of others before self. And then it goes on, I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man to his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Everybody is going to know God, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and I will remember their sins no more. This is what the Lord says. And then it just goes on. But that's the basics of, and I will say, when it says, I'll make a covenant with the house of Israel, he is talking about the covenant people of the house of Israel, which Paul and others would argue that we now, as Christians, are included in with that house of Israel. As we'll look at this week on this week's passage in the lectionary for the first Sunday of ordinal time, is Abraham having his faith credited to him, or righteousness credited to him as by faith. And so the same thing that we fall into the category. We become almost the covenant people, the remnant of Israel, in the sense of you have historical, cultural Israel that still is the remnant of what it was, but you have some essence of the true chosen people as those who are the invisible church. We often think of Christians and Jews as different, whereas, again, I said it again and again, the first Christians in the first century were largely Jewish. So it wasn't I'm leaving Judaism and taking on Christianity. Christianity was a new expression or a fulfilled expression of Judaism. If you turn the page and you go to the top to Jehoiakim, he is one that you'll hear. You don't really need to remember him other than the fact that he and his sons all the way down to Zedekiah, they were all in succession of the time of Jeremiah. And it has Lamentations because Jeremiah is thought, and this is why in part why he's called the weeping prophet. He is credited the book of Lamentations, which is filled with sorrow and mourning and lament, is thought to be credited to him. But Jeremiah then, so when you think of the southern kingdom, going back, the southern kingdom, the prophets you really want to remember all the way from the beginning, again, the smaller prophets, you have Rehoboam, that's important to remember him. And then you have from Uzziah, you have the beginning of Isaiah's ministry, which will continue all the way through exile. But you want to remember Uzziah and Isaiah. Also, as we talk, Ahaz, who married, no, it's Ahaz. Ahaz. Am I wrong? Who did Ahaz marry? Hold on a second. I think I'm conflating two people.
It's his son of Ahaz is Hezekiah.
Ahaz married, oh, that's Ahaz, not Ahab. That's why I was confused. So Ahab is in the northern kingdom, and that's where Elijah comes into play. Ahaz, that's important to remember that. He was the super evil one. And then, so again, Isaiah was sort of the first, when you think of the southern kingdom, and you're putting prophets in their lines, what you want to remember is Isaiah was first, Jeremiah was second, Micah was in the middle. But if you just remember in some sense in the southern kingdom of this kingdom that still holds on to the Davidic line, Isaiah and Jeremiah. And if you do that, then you're in good steps. Maybe there aren't, if you try to remember everyone, you're not going to. Okay, questions about the southern kingdom? Anyone online? Questions? Are you all following along, or are you getting lost in this?
No, but you just mentioned Elijah. Where did
Elijah's in the
he?
north. We're going to get to him now.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I'm trying to, and that's why I'm saying if we remember the United Kingdom as being those two prophets, and then now we're getting into the southern kingdom, and the really sort of three main, but Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah. And remember, Isaiah spans the exile. Jeremiah was prophesying towards the exile too, and prophesied sort of. And again, I think the important thing about Jeremiah, the most important thing about Jeremiah, is that you link him to the prophecy of the new covenant. If you can associate with him, that you'll be doing well. And then you see at the bottom of that Babylonian exile, 586 to 450. And then now we're gonna go back and look at the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, and go through that same period roughly again. Okay, is everyone ready? Everyone's on target? Jeroboam, again, the Solomon's servant, or his officer's son. He eventually was deemed as evil. He was the one who put up the worshiping centers in Dan and Bethel. You have his son who followed, so he tried to claim some sort of lineage or kingdom or dynasty. In 909, you have the usurper of Baasha, and you have a prophet named Jehu. He comes up in some stuff. You don't really need to remember much about him, honestly. And then really the next few. Elah, Zimri, there were no prophets. Basically what you kind of have is a decline from 931 up to Ahab, who was very evil as well, to 874. So you have a period of, what is that, 931 to 8, so about 50 years. Is that 50 years-ish?
50 to 900.
931 to 874, about 50, 60 years. So this is when you have Ahab, and this is the prophet that you probably learned about. This is the evil king Ahab, who was married to Beelzebub, Jezebel, sorry. And this was the period where the worshiping of Baal came because of Jezebel. This was like a hot time for the northern kingdom. This is when you have Elijah, and you have Obadiah also accredited to this. Obadiah was sort of adjacent. He was the prophet who pronounced doom on the nation of Edom. And if you remember, Edom was a southern eastern territory from Jerusalem, and was the line of Esau. So Jacob and Esau. So again, Israelites. Esau was also the son of Isaac, and but they eventually went and worshipped other ways and married people, and then they got in trouble in that regard. But Elijah is the prophet, as you expect, as you know, is one of the main prophets of northern, and then he is followed by his counterpart Elisha. So when you think, and when you look at that, you see red in Elijah. Think of northern kingdom when you think of red. These were all bad kings. And actually, you see at the bottom of Ahab, it says down there, it says very evil too. He did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. So of all of the northern kings, he was the goat of evil. So his son claimed, Azariah comes in, and you still have Elijah. Elisha follows, and you have Jerome. He was the son of Ahab, so again you have some sort of genetic line coming down. Elijah is known for a number of things. We learn about him in sort of various times, but of sort of motifs or themes of stories of his battle at the altar, where they pour water over his altar, and he puts all these challenges, and obviously, and then and whose altar would light first. And despite all of the challenges he puts in his way, lightning comes out of the sky and lights the altar, and then and it gives people pause. He is also the prophet that when he leaves, he's one of the few, other than Moses, who they say he's buried in Genesis, or in the Pentateuch. They say he's buried somewhere, but we don't really have any record of that. And Elijah was one of the few that actually were taken from the earth in a supernatural way. So when you think of this is just an aside, but when you think of the transfiguration during Lent, when we talk about that, Elijah and Moses were with Jesus, and they represented the law and the prophets to some extent, but you don't really see a lot of this sort of past figure representation in such a real way. Like I'm not developing a theology around this, but when you see the figure of Elijah and Moses, and we don't have a record of Moses' death, it makes me wonder as a theologian, is there something, was Moses sort of, taken from the earth in a supernatural way, or was he buried? I don't know. Did he die of natural causes? Was he taken before? Perhaps their ability to be there in some form for the transfiguration with Christ has to do with their nature of their departure. Because what I don't want to do is develop a theology that anyone in the Old Testament who's ever died can somehow appear in some sort of transmortified way, or transfigured way. And they weren't the ones transfigured, but otherwise, theoretically, Adam could show up, or Enoch, or any of these old David just shows up. We don't have any of that, but you have this, and so when you think of Elijah, think of the battle with the most evil king Ahab, and think of the fact that he was taken supernaturally, and he passed his mantle on to Elisha. Elisha's named, he continued on prophesying against the evil of the northern kingdom, and he's at that great story of the kids mocking him and cursing him at him, and then mocking him because of his bald head, and then he curses them, and then bears come out and eat the kids, which is a great illustrated. It's solid. I know you try to dig yourself out of that hole. No, I'm good. Jehu is another one. From 841 to 814. We're on the next page. Again, prophet Elisha. In the succession of those kings, you have King Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, and then you have again in succession Jehoahash, all the way down to Jeroboam the second. And Jeroboam the second is kind of where you get, so when you think of the northern kingdom, think evil, Ahab, and you think the pinnacle of that evil is Ahab, and that's where Elisha comes onto the scene. In a succession of sons, you have a succession also to some extent of prophets in the northern kingdom, Elijah to Elisha. And then you get down to Jeroboam, and you're getting closer, and so we're not far. We're 60 years from exile. This is where you have the dating. I'll say the dating of Jonah, and the story of Nineveh. And the reason I say dating is that's a book that doesn't really have a particular time exactly. Although I do have Jonah as 760 in the midst of that, which falls into this category on the cards. That's thought when it was set because of the historic events. But the story of Jonah has a much more metaphoric or symbolic representation for Jews rather than a historic one. But it does, Jonah points as a prophet, he sort of stands on his own. Again, the Great Assembly sort of put that into play as, and you got to ask, well, this is God calling Jonah to go to Nineveh because they needed to hear a message of repentance. Jonah doesn't want to do it because he doesn't like them, and so God sends him back in a whale. So there's a metaphor there, and it's used to, and there's lots of metaphors actually about the story in literature. But what that's more referring to is we often in theological conversations look at Jonah's prophecy as an early sign of God's inclusion of Gentiles. You get that? Oh, we're fine. They'll see the light over there. You see Amos there. Amos is often depicted as a shepherd. Amos is also our social justice prophet. Israel, from the very beginning, as establishment as a nation, was always called to do things differently, to care for the poor, to love the poor, to welcome the stranger. This is what we do in the Hiker Center. We welcome the stranger because God's first claim, God's first sort of like, hey, you should be doing this to the Israelites was to welcome the stranger. So Amos picks up this motif again, around the same time as of Jonah and Hosea. Amos, just if you think of him as the shepherd condemning injustice, he was known for his condemnation of social injustices, for the oppression of the poor, and he said God's sense of justice demands that Israel functions in a righteous space and shows compassion for the marginalized and the oppressed and the poor. And so if you think of Amos, think of him as a shepherd, but this is the period he comes in. He's a contemporary with Hosea. Hosea is not often talked about. You'll never see him in any Sunday school curriculum because Hosea is one of the most controversial prophets because he basically compares God's relationship with Israel to his relationship to his wife, who is a whore, a prostitute. And she has relations with all these men, and basically Hosea becomes the representative of the God figure, and Homer becomes this sort of prostitute figure who sells herself to all the nations and all the men, and so you don't see that in too many Sunday school curriculum for children. Because those words you have to use to describe that unfaithfulness is probably not something that is common. You have then, what I want you to notice as we move forward from here, you have no prophets that follow, no major prophets that follow, all the way through up to Hosea in 732 to 722. That king is the one who entered into also relationship with Assyria, but double-crossed the king, and it basically led to the exile of the northern kingdom and the diaspora of the northern kingdom into Assyria, which was north. So modern-day Turkey, to the extent of modern-day Turkey. Again, I would say if you're thinking about, again, southern kingdom, you're thinking about Isaiah, you're thinking about Micah, you're thinking about Jeremiah. Northern kingdom, you're thinking about Isaiah, you're thinking about Elisha, and you're thinking about Amos and Hosea. And really not even, and Amos and Hosea, just as long as you associate them with the northern kingdom, you get a sense of God was saying to them, you're selling yourself to everybody. And they were on a trajectory. So northern kingdom bad, southern kingdom mostly bad, northern kingdom, again, probably the most wicked of all the kings, even in the southern and the north. I think in general, the northern kingdom is looked at as being much more evil. And then they have I don't know why it says, is that right? I should say Babel, I should say Assyrian exile. I think it says, is this Babylonian? It should say Assyrian exile. Cross that up, I just wrote it in wrong. I added a few other things as signifiers. In the midst of exile, you have a couple prophets. So this is during exile. You'll hear the word Nahum. You don't really, there's not a whole lot of stories around him, but there is around Ezekiel and Daniel. In other words, you don't need to know them. But when they were in exile, you have Ezekiel around 570. He spoke about God's judgment God's justice. He called them to personal holiness, and a vision for a return of God's people and and a resurrection of the faithful. And so for the first time in exile, you actually start developing a doctrine of the afterlife, some sort of resurrection, which is not something that all Jews believe in, but it enters into the picture during this exilic period. Which I will say, the Persian Empire has Zoroastrianism connections, and that may be an influence from that as well, but we'll talk about those influences here in a minute. Obviously, it affected them in terms of their understanding of the afterlife. Because the Sadducees, for example, didn't believe in the afterlife. So you start, during this period that's to follow, you'll start to see sects develop within them. But the other prophet, Daniel's a prophet. Nebuchadnezzar, that's named. He was a prophet in exile. He was called the prophet of God's kingdom, sort of the prophecy that God's kingdom would be established, that they would return. He talks about God's sovereignty and hope in an apocalyptic sense. Daniel is one of the Old Testament books that we consider apocalyptic. He sort of presents that picture of the ultimate redemption and the resurrection of the faithful. And so those were the ones that were in exile, and you have King Cyrus come down around 450, or not 450, around, what was the date? Exile, 720, what was the years after that? 70 years after, around 500, I guess, or if it's, it would be 516, I guess, 70 years minus 516. You have King Cyrus come in the picture, sends the Israelites back to Jerusalem. And again, as we've talked about before, this is where, and although they're not considered prophets, they're considered biblical leaders in a different way, but Nehemiah and Ezra come back, one to the task to sort of rebuild the temple, the other task with sort of a reform of identity. And so in the same way, in that southern kingdom, you have Hezekiah and Josiah being the reform agents to sort of keep the southern kingdom on track. They lose a lot of their identity. Esther is also a story that comes out of the exile, but they spent 70 years in Persia. They adapt to their ways, but they still hold on some of their Jewish identity. You see that reflected in Esther, and then they're sent back. So Ezra, Nehemiah, and then the Great Assembly follows, and that's where you get, again, the goal of post-exilic Israel is to reestablish Jewish identity. And this is where Israel goes from being Yahwehists, our God is the best, to Israelite, or to Jews or Israelites, in the sense of our modern day understanding, to monotheism, where there is only one God and Yahweh is the only God. Radical monotheism, in fact, and they doubled down on this idea. And so for the next 500 years after that, to the time of Christ, Israel is in the mindset that God is a single unit. Which again, when you think about the fact that Jesus is coming down, is he a representation? Is he adopted? And he's coming down and claiming equality with this radical monotheism of the Jews in their identity of who they were. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and then I want to just do briefly a few things in the intertestamental period, but before we get to that, does anyone have any questions? I know that's a lot. I don't know if that's even helpful. I'm processing it myself. I'm trying to do it in chunks. Is that helpful in terms of putting the prophets in their kingdoms and in their order in their kingdoms? Again, they're small. I have a list of smaller prophets that we could talk about, but in the end, if you remember the major ones, you're doing well. At least for starting, that's sort of the first phase. If you remember the northern and the southern kingdom, that is such an important division that, quite frankly, most Christians don't ever talk about and don't understand. The division of the kingdom was massive because that plays into the politics of Jesus in modern day Samaria. And again, it was one of the things I was talking about. I didn't mention in this treatment is that as the Israelites came back, the Samaritans, who were just north, these northern Israelites from the northern kingdom, they recognized their Jewish lineage and they wanted to go help. So they're offering to bring help, but those who were exiled into Babylon from the kingdom of Judah were like, no, man, you stayed. You're not part of us. You're not part of the remnant. So that is what's from the beginning of the northern kingdom, southern kingdom separation to now this rejection of their help and rejection. And this also happened with the Edomites in the southeast. There's a rejection of the Israelites. Of the Israelites that came back from exile. There was this sense of we are the covenant. So are you from northern Israel or southern Israel? Do you know? I'm just kidding.
Well,
You don't know, because maybe you're from the northern kingdom.
I think I'm Ashkenazi by my dad's line.
Okay, I'm not even sure how, I don't know what
I
that
don't
means.
know where that, I don't know where.
We'll trace that back. We'll see
Yeah.
whether Mike was from the northern kingdom, where they were all evil, or the southern kingdom, the true line of David.
That is actually my question. Do you think that there is any other way than, we were talking about God's sovereignty and obviously the free will aspects, but there's no question that there wasn't a single good or even neutral king in the northern kingdom that ruled. I mean, it seems
There was,
obvious that
I
that's
think it was
where-
peppered with a little righteousness here and there, but nothing that took. And it may be even if the kings, I mean, you know, these are all historic judgments of their reign. And the Bible does say that they were rebelling. So we have that record of that. But even in the southern kingdom, I think that it's kind of like, it's almost like you can see that as the same line of being evil kings. And idolatry was the main, like, you know, as I was looking at this day, I just kept seeing idolatry, idolatry, idolatry. And I kept thinking, you know, so taking this for a second out of the Old Testament narrative, the notion that idolatry was such a powerful and persuasive force in Israel's wickedness, it makes me wonder, although we don't have other nations we worship, our idolatry has shifted to technology, to money. I think money, wealth, and power, and belongings and these sort of things, this ideal of this affluence that we're meant to live in is probably one of the biggest idolatries we face in the Western world, and we don't wrestle with it. We've normalized it to the place where we're just like, yeah, we can all just live pretty comfortable lives. I mean, look at me, suffering for Jesus in the mountains. I'm the most guilty of it. But yes, to your point, yes.
It just feels very, I mean, we expect, right, the Davidic line in the southern kingdom, what comes out of that, and yet you look at the northern kingdom, and it's interesting that it goes in a completely, you know, fully, it seems, evil direction compared to, and again,
And they move north, so when you think of like Russian Jews, and I'm not saying exactly, I'm not saying they couldn't be from southern Judah, but the Jewish, I mean, and again, as Judaism was established, those who connected themselves to that Judaism, there was still reform in the northern side as well. I mean, there was still, not to say that the northern kingdom lost their Jewishness. They were still Jews. They still, you know, they still took some of the rituals, and I'm sure there's a whole history of sort of those Russian or northern the Jews that went in the diaspora north. There's probably an unfolding of the way, but again, those synagogues and the development of those synagogues also plays a role in that.
That's my family.
Oh, yeah, okay, we'll talk. Oh, I thought you were saying your family's here. Okay, so now we enter into a period, and you see that at the end of the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom, there's a period towards the end where prophets stop. There's no prophecy. And then we enter into what we call the 400 years of silence. And where that is, I'm not 100% sure. Roughly 400 years before Jesus. I don't know if it's exactly 400 years, so I'm not claiming that, but it's roughly 400 years. Also, I think that parallels the slavery too. I think there's a parallel in those. I don't know if it's the exact years or how God judges that. But what I want to point out, and that happened over the point, and I know we only have like 7 minutes left, is from 539 to 531, you have the Persian rule. You have Jerusalem restored in that period at the end of the 500s. You have the reestablishment of Jewish identity. In 331, however, you have Alexander the Great, who comes in, and you have the beginning of the Greek rule. And this is the beginning of Hellenization. This is the beginning of Greek philosophy. Also the beginning of a shift in Jewish thought. And this is important because this shift in the beginning of, we go back and we look at the shift in, or we look at when we talked about the origins of the canonization of the Bible, when you have the Septuagint come around, and it started to be translated into Greek around 200. So in this period of Greek rule, you have the rewriting of the Hebrew texts into Greek. And I said in that series, Jesus was quoting from the Septuagint. Jesus was quoting from a translation of the original Hebrew text. Jesus was speaking in Aramaic, but reading and writing in Greek. So this influence, the significance of Alexander the Great's influence over this region, his conquering of the region, is in no small measure a part of the history of Christianity, because it changes the way we think about. We're going from what was developing into a radical monotheism, is now entering into a historic polytheism with Greek mythology. And what happens when you take the notion of a radical monotheism of God being only one, and you intersect that with a polytheistic tendencies or nature of Greek mythology, now all of a sudden you have the development over the doctrine of the Trinity over the next 500 years. What do we have? We're not monotheistic. We are monotheistic, but we're also polytheistic in the sense three persons in one. We develop a doctrine that is the conflation or the convergence of monotheism and polytheism into, and you have that in writing. And so Alexander the Great in that period of Greek and of conquering and Hellenization cannot be underestimated for how we even see Christ, the philosophical categories, the notion of Jesus being the Word, being in association with the notion of logos. Those are all Greek concepts that come in, and as Christianity develops, is filtered through this Greek lens. In 175 to 164, you have Antiochus the fourth Epiphanes, who is known for the desecration of the temple. He destroyed the temple. He did pagan sacrificial rituals in the temple. He destroys the second temple that was reestablished under Ezra and Nehemiah, and defiles it, and then bans Jewish practices, and no one can be Jews. And this, in a matter of 3 years, there was already sort of a tension growing around Jewish identity, but this is what gives rise to the Maccabean revolt that took place between 167 and 163, so about 4 years. It was a Jewish uprising against the Greek Syrians, the Seleucids, who they were a place where they couldn't, they were an utter persecution under Antiochus's rule. And so the Maccabean revolt began in this, and I was reading a little about it, I don't remember all the details, but basically someone comes to him and tells Matthias that he needs to sacrifice this, do a pagan ritual on a Jewish altar. He says no. He actually kills the guy and someone else, and this sort of is what light. And then he is eventually taken and is in 166. You have the death of Matthias, and I think it's Matthias. Am I saying it right? Matthias, yeah. And his son Judah of Maccabee is the one who carries on, and basically through this Maccabean revolt reestablishes Jewish independence, and then it's starting to spread from there. And it goes, and that Maccabean revolt that happened in 167 to 163 BC lasts until the Romans invade the area in 63, and then you have the beginning of the Roman rule. And this leads right up into the time of Jesus, where when Jesus was born, there was Roman rule. When Jesus was born, there was still this remnant of the Maccabean revolt. When we talk about Judas of Iscariot, when we talk about Simon the Zealot, these were people that come from the line and were connected to this movement of Maccabeans who still wanted to reclaim back from the Romans the independent status they had during this Maccabean era. In the midst of all of this, and I will say the recapture of Jerusalem, I can't believe I almost forgot this, in 164 when they recaptured Jerusalem at the Maccabean revolt. This is when in the destroyed temple there was a candle that was lit there. They had enough oil to last the candle. You know, the thing about there's a candle always lit that represents the continuing essence or presence of God, and so they only had enough oil to light it for the first day, for one day, and they're like, let's try it for 2, and it goes on for 8 days. And this is what gives Jews, and this was, again, 164. We think Hanukkah is like this super old holiday. It's not. It really goes back to about 150 years before Christ, where they celebrate the miracle of 7 or 8 nights of this oil burning without any resupplying of it. And this brings us up to the time of Christ. So Christ comes into a time where Jewish identity was being fought for, where Roman rule was still fairly new. So there's a lot of exercising and flexing, where Persian influences have been a part of Israel's history, where where Greek influences have been massive in Jewish identity. And so this is the setting, and this is the timing. And if we believe in a providential God, that God decides to bring Jesus into the earth. God could have done it 2,000 years later into the present day. And the question I'm going to leave you with today is, why do you think, and we'll pick this up next week, why do you think that God sent Jesus at this time? And I'll give you a hint about what I'm thinking. There is a conflation of thought and culture and a synthesis that's happening there that God wanted a part of the expression of salvation that both takes some from Judaism and some from Greco-Roman world and converges them in a way that produces a new expression of Judaism, which is what we now call Christianity. All right, that was a lot. I hope, I would say, and stuff every Christian should know. I think those major prophets, I think the major kings are just things you should be familiar with if you can familiarize yourself with a timeline. These cards do follow that timeline. So now if you have a set of these, you can cut them up, and when you're here in a few weeks, for those of you online, I'll give you those sleeves and you can make cards out of them if you want them. If you don't, I have some on order. This is a game that you can play. And that's it for this week. Next week, we will start with Jesus, the birth of Jesus,
Jason,
the Gospels account of those. Yes.
did you say earlier that there's 1 week when you're going to be gone?
It's not until the end of the month. It might be your first week here.
Okay.
No, it's July 1st. I think the Wednesday, July 1st. I won't be.
Okay.
So I'll be here all the
Okay.
time. So. Okay, I'm stopping the recording.